Frosty is the apt word there, Rosanna. Well, stay with us. Let's bring in a guest to the conversation. I'm pleased to say we're joined by Luke Coffey, who is the director for the Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and also the former senior special advisor to then British Defense Secretary Liam Fox. Joining us from Washington, D.C. Luke, great to see you. Thanks for staying up late, your time for us. Well, let's just get your views on how NATO should address the China challenge, because this is somewhat of a pivot from the traditional focus of NATO.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. Yes, well, if you go back to the most recent summit communique or declaration from December of 2019, the leaders of NATO sort of danced around the issue of China. In fact, they had a brief sentence about China that said the rise of China poses both challenges and opportunities for NATO. And this was December of 2019. Fast forward to June of 2021, and any talk of opportunities, at least in the declaration, is out of the window. And NATO is starting to focus more on the challenges and, in some cases, the security threats that China poses. But we should not forget that NATO is an intergovernmental security alliance that has an area of responsibility in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. And those aren't my words. Those are the words from the 1949 founding document, the North Atlantic Treaty.
Yes, and I think this hits at what Rosanna was discussing, which is the comments from the NATO Secretary General that China's getting closer to us, even geographically. And part of that is due to what they've done in terms of partnerships with the Belt and Road Initiative and other partnerships with agreements largely through loans. So what do you make of the G7 commitment to have a China Belt and Road-like initiative here, but with a green spin? I mean, do you think it will be effective or perhaps a little too late?
Honestly, the stuff about Green Belt and Road, I think, is mainly for domestic political consumption for Western audiences. Practically, I don't see this really coming to much. But the China problem or the China threat does pose a conundrum for NATO. NATO, as I said, is an intergovernmental security alliance. So many of the challenges that China poses to Europe and the United States and Canada are about hybrid, misinformation and some of the dodgy infrastructure investments and deals that we see in Central and Eastern Europe. These are issues that NATO lacks the policy competencies to deal with. There is no legislative power in NATO. There are no sanctions competencies given to NATO. NATO is a security and military alliance at the end of the day. And that's why I thought it was interesting that when the NATO communique did mention China, and when the Secretary General did mention China, in the security and military context, they focused on China's nuclear arsenal. And people forget, in 1949, NATO was created as a nuclear alliance, and today it remains a nuclear alliance. That's its number one mission, is to provide a nuclear deterrent. And nuclear weapons are perhaps for NATO one of the biggest challenges coming from China.
And can we talk for a second, Luke, about the difference between what we're seeing with regards to NATO between the Biden and the Trump administration, specifically with regard to Article 5, the idea that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all and they'll respond cohesively. For the first time, we've seen them talking about that relating to cyber attacks and ransomware.
Yeah, this debate is very interesting. I've been following NATO issues for years, and I'm always puzzled by people who question what sort of attack can be an Article 5 attack, because Article 5 is not a trigger. There's not a set list of criteria that have to be met before NATO invokes Article 5. Ultimately, invoking Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which, as you mentioned, is the collective security aspect of the organization, invoking Article 5 ultimately is a political decision. It has to be taken on a unanimous basis by all members of NATO, and they can determine if an attack on one member was in fact to be considered an attack on all. Now, in terms of the differences we see between President Biden and President Trump, well, I mean, they're pretty much as clear as day. President Trump was dancing around the issue of committing America unconditionally to Article 5 and support for any Article 5 scenario. He eventually came around to it, but it took a while, whereas President Biden from the very beginning stated very clearly that the United States would honor this commitment under any circumstances.
And look, we can't discuss NATO without talking Russia. It is by its existence about Russia, or originally the Soviet Union. When asked in a post-meeting press conference about Ukraine and its potential membership of NATO, Biden was saying, look, it would still have some work to do in terms of cleaning up the government. So what role does Ukraine now play in NATO relations and in terms of countering Russia?
Well, Russia always remains the top agenda item at any NATO summit. As you mentioned, NATO was created to deter and, if necessary, defeat the Soviet Union and to stop the spread of communism into Western Europe. And even though the Soviet Union doesn't exist today, Russia still poses a challenge to Europe's security architecture. And we've seen this with invasions and partial occupations of European countries such as Georgia, Ukraine. There's even a frozen conflict with a large Russian troop presence in Moldova. These countries are not in NATO. They aspire to join NATO someday. And NATO has an open door policy. If you're a European country and you can advance the cause of the alliance, then you have the potential to join. And Ukraine and Georgia, for example, they may not be ready to join tomorrow, but who knows what the future will hold. And many of the same arguments against these countries joining the alliance someday were the same arguments we heard in the early 1990s for countries like Poland or Estonia, and they're now in NATO and some of the most productive members that the alliance has.
Luke, just finally, we understand President Biden has been preparing extensively for his meeting with Vladimir Putin. What looks like a win for the U.S. president in these talks?
Well, I don't expect anything meaningful to come out of this in geopolitical terms. I think both of these leaders are going into this meeting for domestic reasons. For President Putin, just the mere fact that he was invited to the summit, the fact that he looks like an equal to the president of the United States works well for him and looks great for him domestically in Russia. For President Biden, all he has to do is get through the meeting with Putin looking strong, perhaps calling Putin out on human rights abuses, Russia's military aggression, whether it's in Syria, Ukraine, or Georgia, and then he looks like a winner. Because politically speaking in the United States, I'm sure President Biden is aware that the most immediate point of reference for his meeting with Putin in Geneva will be President Trump's meeting with Putin in Helsinki. And that was a diplomatic disaster for the United States, the way that meeting played out. So I think this is in the back of Biden's mind, that people will compare it to what was generally considered by both sides of the aisle in America a very bad summit between Trump and Putin.
Understood, Luke. So low bar for success, it seems you're saying. Luke, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation, and thank you to Rosanna as well. Do stay with us right here on Street Signs. We'll be right back.